start with the people. And so if there is a situation happening that is so kind of pervasive as the one that we're experiencing right now in the Twin Cities, how is it impacting my people's ability to show up and be supported and, and yes, do their work?
Hello, and welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky. My guest today is Ayme Zemke, Chief Client Officer and Certified Crisis Communication Leader at Beehive Strategic Communication in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. We talked about crisis communication, understanding what is really important, especially when you're dealing with an ongoing crisis. I think you're going to find this a really important conversation. Thank you for joining today. Ayme, I'm so excited to be talking with you today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here and happy to be talking to you today.
First question out of the gate. What would be the title of a book about you if your worst enemy wrote it?
That is a very tough question. I think it would be one of two. So the first one that I think of is permanently wearing rose-colored glasses. Second, maybe a little bit more punchy version, what it would be, why isn't she panicking?
Oh, that's a good one. Now, do you have a particular enemy in mind, or are you just thinking in general?
I'm thinking, around the focus of our conversation. So definitely thinking about it through the lens of crisis communication. And I think one of the things that strikes a lot of people that I work with and talk to is when a crisis hits, a lot of people feel that fear and anxiety come up. And I go to a very, very calm place. And not only is it a calm place, but it's a place of optimism. I really believe in the adage that every crisis is an opportunity. And I think that's a little bit different perspective. And I think that, at least initially, it might be a little bit off putting to someone who doesn't understand why I'm not panicking along with them.
Yes, exactly. Well, and in a crisis, it is helpful to have people who are calm and thinking rationally and strategically about what is happening. Okay, I like both of those names of those books. So let me know when that book is out because I'm going to get it, want to read it. And to get us started, I'd love to ask a personal question. So everyone has a moment in their life that has changed how they think about leadership or about taking care of other people. What was one of those moments for you?
I think for me, early in my career, I had the opportunity to work with some folks that brought a lot of expertise to our field and to the work that I do. And I watched how they managed through difficult situations. So I worked in the early of my career, I worked in public affairs. And so pretty high stakes, sometimes involved, you know, fatalities or accidents or, really high stakes legislation. And I got the opportunity to watch people on how they responded to that. And I think it wasn't really just, I don't think there was one specific incident or time that really kind of turned things for me. But I think I really absorbed what I felt worked well and what didn't. I think I really kind of paid attention to where I felt like they were having a really positive, important impact versus where it was just creating more noise. And so I think over the course of my career, I just kind of started picking those pieces to say, oh, this is what I want to emulate. This is where I see it really working. And then trying to marry that with just kind of who I am as a human, I think is what really kind of helped me find my approach. I don't know that there was a single incident or issue that I can share though.
Okay, okay. Well, it sounds like you worked with some people who were good people to learn from. And as we all know, experience is a great teacher as well. You mentioned something I think is so important when we're thinking about crisis communications, which is noise. And certainly these days with social media and our 24/7 news cycle, there's a lot more noise out there. I'd love to dive into a specific thing that's going on near you right now. You are in St. Paul, Minnesota, and there's a massive ongoing crisis happening right now. And you are a crisis communicator. So I'm so curious how you are thinking about this moment and how you are helping your clients think about communications and tune out the noise.
Yeah, so I'm in the Twin Cities, as you said, and as I think most people know, right now we have a really heavy federal government presence through ICE and Border Patrol, and it's a little all-encompassing right now at this particular moment in time, and it is creating a lot of noise and a lot of distraction. And I think it's interesting when you think about clients and business leaders and, what role do they play here? They can play a lot of different roles, honestly, but I think where I find a lot of my conversations focusing is what am I supposed to tell my employees? What am I supposed to tell my teams? Because right now, it really is, I think, primarily the people that are in this geography, the people who live and work in this community that have the most direct impact. So there's always, a customer piece of this. I certainly want to acknowledge that too. But I think when it comes to what is the most immediate need to try to think about addressing in the midst of all of this, it really is how do I talk to my people? How do I make sure that my team and my employees and my people have a sense of stability in what is a really uncertain and disruptive time? And so it is one of those situations right now where it is difficult to focus on work. It is, it is really an all-encompassing situation. And so for leaders, it can also feel scary, right? It can be a scary time to step into that conversation. It feels divisive, it feels political. And I think traditionally, business leaders certainly have tried to stay away from those kinds of conversations, right? Politics was always kind of a taboo topic for a really long time. Anything that felt divisive, felt like, oh, we can't talk about that. We got to stay really neutral. And what I would say is that it feels like right now is an opportunity when something like this, certainly of this scale, it doesn't have to be of this scale, but certainly of this scale is happening. There's a way you can communicate and talk with your people. You don't necessarily have to dive into the politics of it. You don't have to, do something that feels divisive, but to not acknowledge it is far worse than any misstep you might be afraid of making by talking. I think that the real challenge is the silence is deafening. And so it's really important that leaders think about how they want to address this and make sure that they are talking with their people because that communication starts to provide some level of stability and certainty when everything else feels the opposite of that.
Right. And as you mentioned, so many people are impacted by this in so many different ways, whether something's happening in their neighborhood or they or friends or family are involved directly. I would imagine that practically every employee right now in the Twin Cities is dealing with some level of this. And I liked what you said about silence. And I think sometimes there's such a fear of saying the wrong thing that we default to not saying anything. And we all know that is so much worse. But in the moment, keeping things close feels like the thing to do. Why on earth is that?
Leaders are human, right? And in a time like this, a time when it feels frightening or it feels, very unstable, it is very human to feel stuck or frozen or maybe a little bit paralyzed and not really sure what to do. And I feel like sometimes that's what's stopping people from speaking up is just this kind of feeling of being frozen and not really knowing what is the right step to take. And I think what's important for leaders to remember is in times like this, even though we might all be feeling those things, if you're a leader, inactivity and silence, those are not options for you. You have to find a way through that. And one of the things we talk to our clients about a lot, and that I talk to other people about quite a bit in terms of leadership and what to say, go back to your values as an organization. If you don't know what to say, really take a step back, look at your values, really think about who you are as an organization. What do you stand for? What have you promised? What expectations have you set for your people and your culture? That's always the best place to start. That is a really important guide for how you want to start having some of those conversations. The other thing I would say is make sure you're listening. I think that is a very common mistake when it comes to crisis communication is, and again, I think it's because we're nervous or anxious or, to your point, afraid to say the wrong thing. People just kind of barrel forward. And it's really important to understand where people are at so that you can meet them where they're at and have conversations that really get to their concerns, their questions, what they might have on their mind. So making sure that you are listening and letting your values guide that conversation, those are really good starting points to try to get past that kind of feeling of frozen and fear and boy, I should say something, but I don't know what to say, so I'm not saying anything. That kind of helps take that first step.
Right. Well, as you're saying that, I'm thinking organization and values and culture, and then crisis. And that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where you find out if your values, if you live by them, if they matter, if your employees care about them, all of those really tough questions. So I can see how scary it would be.
Yeah, it absolutely is where your values are tested. I think that it's one thing to have values in an organization, it's another to live those values. And it's even another to let those values be your North Star, essentially. Are they what you use to make your decisions? Do they ground kind of what choices you make as a leader and as an organization? That's when those values really, really come to life in a way that is incredibly meaningful. Or the flip side, if you don't use those as your grounding and your guide, that's where things fall apart really quickly because what people have come to believe and expect from you, if your actions don't follow up the words that you've used, that is a very, very quick way to lose trust.
Right. And then they're just words on your website or on the wall of your lobby at headquarters.
Exactly, exactly. And honestly, that's worse than not having values at all, in my opinion. If they're just words on a wall, you don't really have values.
Right. They're just pretty shapes on
Exactly.
the wall.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Now, we're talking specifically about this particular event that's going on, and it's been going on for quite a while. And at this point, we don't know when it's going to end. So, what is different about a crisis that has a pretty clear start and stop time versus something that is continuing? And especially when you don't really have a sense of when it's going to be over.
Yeah, I think, it certainly is challenging because in addition to just saying something in the first place and communicating, there's an expectation for ongoing communication. And it can be very difficult when it is, especially when it goes on for a long time. It is something that in this particular case, kind of leaves everyone feeling a little exhausted, not even a little, a lot exhausted. And as a leader, continuing to communicate, even if you're not saying anything terribly different, is really important. Checking in on your people very regularly is important, and it really does become your full time job. So it can be challenging, right? Because you still have to balance keeping your organization moving forward and the things that you do as a leader anyway. But if your people aren't coming along with you, if your people don't feel safe, if they don't feel supported, all those other business goals are going to go out the window. And so, really making sure you've got a very steady presence, especially when something is ongoing, and really understanding again where your people are at. So making sure to listen and figure out how do you best support. Do they need resources? Do they need maybe a reduced focus? Just being really smart about what's needed so that the business or the organizational priorities can continue to move forward, but in a way that people can feel they can manage it.
One thing you said I think is so important that it's okay to keep repeating the same message generally over time. And in fact, we know that when someone is in emotional distress, it is harder to hear messaging, it's harder to remember it. Even if you were specifically listening for someone to say something, it's still going to be harder for you to hear it and remember it. So that repetition piece is so important, especially in this case where the crisis hasn't ended.
Yes, repetition is really important. Absolutely. In fact, that's something that even when we're coaching for a media interview, for instance, really important to have it feels to you like you're saying the same thing over and over again. But for the people that are taking the message in, to your point, either they may not have heard it the first time or they're hearing it in a different way. With different kinds of learners, people here, understand things verbally or visually or experientially. And so making sure you're thinking about different ways to communicate that message. And also, it just really reinforces and signals to folks what to focus on. And so, a message heard over time, several times over time, really does make sure that people stay focused on the right thing versus trying to share 15 different messages and people aren't really sure where to look. That repetition is actually a bit reassuring and comforting because it gives a focal point to the people who are taking that in.
Right. And I think I would imagine it can feel very strange to someone who isn't used to just saying the same thing over and over again. And I think my father was a professor, a university professor, and the number of times he would say things to us and then repeat it in a different way. And I remember thinking, I heard you the first time. But as I got older, I realized, oh, I get why he's doing this. That's what he does as an instructor. That's not what most of us do. So I bet it feels uncomfortable for leaders also because in this case where you're talking about this ongoing crisis, it's also uncomfortable because you want the thing to be over and you want to stop thinking about it.
Right. Absolutely. I think that, that is the hope at the end of the day is everyone wants to just get through it. I also think that that's a really important thing to talk about too, is that even in a crisis that feels like it has a more defined start and finish, it is really important to not be so anxious to move on from the crisis that you don't help your people kind of step through what they are experiencing and feeling. So when we talk about crisis here at Beehive, we often talk about it in four phases. And the first two are, preparing for it and responding to it. But the second two are really about how do you start to restore and how do you then move forward. It is really important that you don't give that short shrift because that is where the learnings happen. And that is how you help people come through things emotionally and understand what has changed, or a different approach, for instance, where's the support for me to be able to move forward? And then as an organization, what did we learn from it? What might we as an organization want to do differently as a result of what we've experienced? And I think that is another area where I see people, they want to move on so badly that they forget that part, and you kind of run the risk then of repeating mistakes.
Right. And everyone in your organization is experiencing this thing differently
Absolutely.
for all of the reasons, because we're each individual and some are stressed out about it and they're never going to show you that they are. And some are not as stressed about it, just naturally they're not. And continuing with the messaging is a way to make sure you're reaching everybody when they're able to hear it.
Yeah. I think too, making sure that, it's not up to just one leader in an organization. It's making sure that you are equipping many leaders, sometimes managers, depending on how you're structured as an organization, making sure that you are equipping other folks in your team and across the organization to help you with that communication as well. It can't fall on the shoulders of one person. Again, we're all human, and a leader can do a lot and needs to do a lot, but doesn't need to shoulder everything on his or her own shoulders. There is strength and support in numbers in that case. And the consistency then that can happen is really important. I think people talk a lot about how the relationships within an organization, your trust is with your direct supervisor or manager. And so making sure that that person has what they need to be able to help lead some of those conversations, answer some of those questions. So a lot of times we'll, look at things like, can you do a toolkit that provides some messaging and some Q&A and do some training, like really light training so that those folks feel like they can have that conversation, that they're empowered to do that as a leader within the organization.
Right. What is, the most common question that leader or leadership team comes to you with when there's a crisis?
Depends what stage of the crisis.
Oh, okay.
And it depends on the type of the crisis, honestly. So something that is more of like a social issue, which I suppose you could say is sort of what's happening in Minneapolis, right? Social political issue. Usually the first question is, do we need to get involved? Do we actually need to say something? Is this really our lane? And so I think some of it is just should we talk at all? I think if they're in the midst of a crisis that is, something is truly on fire and burning and is having a true business implication, it's how do we stop the situation that's happening? Like how do we stop the bleeding? How do we make sure that we are addressing this in a way that will preserve our reputation and allow us to move on and preserve the business? And if they've just gone through a crisis situation, they're on the back end of it, usually it is how do we rebuild that trust? Because oftentimes there's a loss of trust when a crisis occurs. And so a lot of times you'll see organizations that are looking to build that trust back up, both internally and outside of the organization.
Okay. All right. Those seem like important questions, and I know that you help your clients think about what those are. And it's interesting to me we're talking about like a social political situation that isn't for the most part, it's having a business impact on businesses that might not even be anywhere near the actual action. And I imagine that at least early on in something like this, it's really hard for leaders to think about, is this going to have a business impact on me? I feel like we still struggle to think about the mental health and emotional impact if we don't see a physical impact.
Yes. Well, and I think when we think about business impact, I think some leaders look strictly at the revenue numbers or how's this going to impact my ability to meet my business goals for the year, to grow my business, to, whatever it is, whatever the metric is that they're looking for. And I think the thing that's really important is to start with the humans, start with the people. And so if there is a situation happening that is so kind of pervasive as the one that we're experiencing right now in the Twin Cities, how is it impacting my people's ability to show up and be supported and and yes, do their work. But I think we all are smarter now about well-being and making sure that our teams and our employees have what they need to be successful. And when things are kind of crumbling all around, they don't. And so I think making sure you're putting your people first, because at the end of the day, it's your people that are going to help you, ultimately reach whatever business goals you're looking to reach. But I would argue that that really should be the first question that you ask yourself is how are my people doing?
Absolutely. All right. Amy, I could go on for a very long time with many more questions that I have, but we're getting close to the end of our time. So thank you so much for sharing. And can you share with our listeners a little bit more about yourself and what you do and what Beehive does?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I am the Chief Client Officer at Beehive Strategic Communication. We are a boutique strategic communication agency in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we work with clients across a lot of different industries, both on internal and external communication. So helping them create meaningful connection and engagement inside their organizations as well as outside the organizations, always grounded in, trust and making sure they're able to connect with the people that matter. Beehive is a certified B Corp, which means that we put people and planet above profit. We are, of course, a business, but we are really, really dedicated and committed to making sure that the work that we do is values aligned and purpose driven. And we're really proud to be able to partner with clients who feel the same.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. And thank you again for being here today and talking about this subject, which is very present and very real for you right now, I know.
It is, and I appreciate the opportunity. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, yeah. And thank you to our listeners for listening to this episode of Notes on Resilience, and we will catch you next time. Thank you for listening to Notes on Resilience. I'm Manya Chilinsky, a speaker and advisor. My work focuses on how leaders support people through pressure and disruption. The show is edited by Neil Panji, and it's hosted on Buzzsprout. Subscribe to the podcast to stay connected and sign up for the newsletter at manyachilinsky.com/notes for monthly insights and updates.